Grazie, Professor Garcia. So I will be talking in English, despite the fact that among other things I'm Italian. I don't know if that's going to need some adjustments in terms of the translation. Some of you, I opted for English because among other things, the terminology that is used in the literature often is English. So I thought that being an international forum, I prefer. Having said that, if later on during the discussion or the question and answers you feel more comfortable in asking things in Italian, I'll be more than happy to try and reply. So, is everyone okay with the simultaneous translation? I'll just go ahead. Okay. Right, so pharmaceutical cognitive enhancers, Professor Garcia just mentioned, these are some of the ways in which we can try to go beyond our normal levels of attention, memory, and so forth. And they can tentatively be defined as drugs which have shown to improve some degree of the human cognition, like attention, executive functioning, like planning and problem solving, memory, learning, and this has happened through the alteration of our neurotransmitters, okay? And the interesting thing, and here the connection with therapy is rather obvious, is that the vast majority of those current so-called smart drugs are the result of therapeutic intervention. So some of the most famous PCE, pharmaceutical cognitive enhancers, are medicines or drugs that are used for ADHD condition, narcolepsy. Here I've just put a few in the image, Adderall and Ritalin. And yet they have gradually become more and more used. I will show you in a second, before mentioning this other wave of cognitively enhance our cells, which can be through transcranial direct current stimulation or also transcranial magnetic stimulation. But I will not be talking about this other technique, first of all, because they are less spread, and secondly, because the effects are still more limited comparing with the smart drugs. And the reason why also I think is relevant to focus on the PCE is that, as shown in the literature, this is from nature and it dates back just a few days, like last week. And you can see yourself, I mean, it's the 5th of July, and the use of smart drugs on the rise, and Ritalin is mentioned as one of the names that is present both in the US and in the European campuses. And the idea, of course, is related to this willingness to be as competitive as possible, be it for altruistic reasons. If I perform particularly well in a physics exam, I might be able to help humanity, or simply out of egoistic advantages. Okay, we'll look into that in a second. Now, there are, of course, various levels of tensions. One of these is the local and global effects, okay? So the local effect being the enhancement of the individual performance, and the global effects being the unwanted social results deriving from the spreading of the use of cognitive enhancers. And of course, in order to understand this, we need to take into consideration two main concepts that are relevant to the discussion, namely that of autonomy, and the consequence is privacy, our right to privacy, and the way that we should allow individuals to enhance themselves if they want to do so without hurting anyone else, and fairness. which is a socially appreciated value. Okay? If anything is unclear, I should have said that up front, feel free to interrupt me at any moment, okay? Now, trying to define a little bit more what are the effects of PC, we could tentatively define those in 3 categories. So the first one being that the enhancer has acute or chronic effect. So in this case, shortly after taking the drug, the performance is significantly better than average. In the second case, there is a growing or lasting effect which is poised to diminish when one stops taking the drug. And obviously you can make a pretty linear connection, I would imagine, with the example of doping in sports. If you think of athletes that are able to boost their performance, that, I don't know, microsecond that allows them to win a golden medal rather than, you know, a right third or fourth, actually, I meant no medals. The second effect is that is sometimes a bit more dramatic, and one aspect that we will not look into in depth in this talk, but needs further consideration, is the addiction that such drugs can give. Because they've recently only started to be used so broadly, the studies are still limited, but obviously as any other altering substance, the risk is out there. If nothing else, certainly there is a dimension that is psychological. If I know that I perform in a certain way once I take a certain substance, say Ritalin, then the risk is out there. And we will look into that later on with a few examples I will bring you. And of course, one third feature is that of the varying safety, availability, and legal permissibility that such substances can have. For example, staying within the North American context, within the US, not all states have the same approach towards the drugs. In certain states, you could go to jail if you provide, say, Ritalin or Adderall that, as we said initially, are meant for therapeutic purposes to someone that doesn't need them. In other states, it's basically, it doesn't have any real legal consequences. And of course, this aspect is something that should be taken into account because the way that you might approach the given drug might change. Think, for example, of the way that one can conceptualize using drugs in a country where, say, marijuana is legal, like Holland. That can have an effect in the way that you also pose yourself to using it. And it's an interesting thing. Now, what is important to take into consideration, and this Reco points it with this quotation, is that they also affect the emotional states of individuals that undergo the treatment, okay? So he writes, such alterations appear to be an important dimension of the drug effects that users perceive to enable improved academic performance. He's talking again specifically about the academic context, but as understandable, the fact that I'm taking a substance that alters my performances does affect it in some ways also my emotional state. If nothing else, the fact that I feel more confident boosts my mood, and this way of changing the balance of substances such as dopamine and so forth in our brain is something that deserves attention. I will not be talking about this, but Professor Marazziti will be talking, I think, on Thursday, if I'm not mistaken, about emotional enhancement. Is a fascinating topic, and she's great. So you will have the opportunity to follow on this path. But yet, just for the time being, just let's try to keep in mind to understand a little, some under considered aspects that the dopaminergic system can be affected by substances such as Ritalin and Adderall, and that is something that could be connected with what I just said, namely the addiction system, which works exactly in the same way. So in other words, if I'm particularly pleased with the fact that I keep on getting A in my exams in uni, that can provide, can produce an addiction in me, okay? The degree of that addiction and how difficult or how much it can hook me up, that's a different story. As I said, it needs more studies, but it's something that we should take into consideration, okay? Now, with my friend and colleague Andrea Lavazza, we wrote a few papers in which we tried to claim that one important aspect is that we should try to ensure that the use of those PC are disclosed, at least. It's kind of hard to imagine that people will stop, even, as we saw with the title of Nature, it's obvious that students, whether pressed by society or because of their own choices, or perhaps a combination of two, they are just keeping on using those more and more. But one way of contrasting this phenomena from damaging our society too much is that of ensuring disclosure of PC, okay? And I'll tell you gradually, hopefully, a bit more why that should be so. But the intuitive problem with asking someone to disclose part of their private choice is, as we said earlier, is the interference with privacy, with the private sphere of one's moral conduct, especially in context where it's not explicitly stated that you need to share with the rest of the community the use of a certain substance. Why should you? And so privacy is part of more general right to immunity of the person, and through the principle of inviolate personality, it preserves a space of non-interference by others, okay? And due also to past experiences that we have had across the globe, and unfortunately we still have actually, it's comprehensible that we want to preserve this intrusion from the authority in our lives. But it is precisely for this reason that if we want to allow a little bit more intrusion in this private sphere, we need to find a counterbalancing moral reason that can make the claim a bit more legitimate. Okay? And another aspect to take into consideration in terms of global effects is the fact that, as Kohn has argued, is the fact that this, not only him, but is one of the main authors, is that perhaps through these PCs, we might be able to rebalance some structural inequalities among people. Perhaps an individual that is born and raised in an environment that doesn't allow much possibilities in terms of, I don't know, books or other resources, through a chemical boost will be able to compensate an initial disadvantage towards his or her Western the Western colleagues, say. And of course, one can argue that, and perhaps it can be agreed with, but this tends to be the argument that is used more generally in favor of enhancement. So any form of enhancement can help someone that is in a more disadvantageous initial position to boost themselves up to the level of the normal, normalcy, okay? But I mean, that can make sense as long as those that are at the normalcy level don't speed themselves up in a sort of rat race. So that's perhaps not as optimistic as Connie defines it. Now, the aspect that I think it's interesting is the fact that no matter what are our views on the way that those PC can work for the specific individuals, the potential dysfunctional social consequences are related to this undisclosedness that at the moment is present in our society. And by our society, I mean Western society. Okay? And as I will show you shortly, the idea there is that if one is used to take such drugs and eventually those become unavailable for whatever reason, there can be a disbalance in society that at times can actually be risky and dangerous for all society. So let's try to bring it to some specific examples that might help us picture more specifically what we're talking about. Now let's imagine that Adam and Eve are two colleagues in the same university department, okay? And they respect each other, and they think that they have the same chances to win this new job opening, you know, for a tenure. And so the university tells them that they have 2 weeks to prepare themselves and study for this test that they are going to take. And they do so. Actually, they even study together, so they prepare themselves in a respectful way towards each other. Now, just before the exam, Adam takes a 15 milligram Adderall tablet. And he asks Eve if she wants to take it as well. And she says, no, thank you, I'll do without. And eventually, Adam is the one that gets the job. Now, what they didn't know is that on top of evaluating the answers, yeah, of course, it's a bit of a stretch, this example, yeah, like all examples are. The commission was going to also evaluate the speed with which they were going to answer these questions. And Eve, in fact, had answered one more questions right, but in a longer time span. And because they were evaluating also the responsiveness, they opted for Adam. And once she realizes this to be the point, she thinks that is completely unfair, because obviously the PC that Adam took allowed him to outperform her, although she has more knowledge, and if he had not taken the drug, or if she had taken Adderall, it's extremely likely that they would have at least ended at the same time. Now, she asks Adam to tell the commission what really happened, and he disagrees, and he says, no, there is no way that I'm going to resign or not accept the result, for a number of reasons. First of all, I did give you the choice to take the drug and you didn't. And secondly, there is no legal impediment for me to use such a drug. Let's assume that the context is such in which, you know, there is no legal restriction. And why didn't she, for example, mention the fact that she had 3 coffees in the morning? By the way, caffeine and nicotine also are cognitive enhancers, although they are not as intense. Now, so the starting conditions would have been unfair because their performance would still not correspond to their real normal capacities. Okay. Now, in this case, one can culturally, perhaps, at least in Italy, I mean, everyone would probably expect that before an exam you take a coffee, not perhaps to boost your performance simply because it's part of our culture, you take it. And in a sense, the fact that everyone is taking it, the vast majority in one way or another, an espresso, cappuccino, balances it. Whereas the Adderall, with the Adderall or other smart drugs, it's different. And on top of that, we don't really know the overall effects. Okay. Now, another example, this is already more social. Now, let's imagine that with short notice, the Ministry of Education decides to sample high school students. Okay, and let's assume, for the sake of argument, these students are all above 18. Okay. Now, the idea there is to assess the quality of education, so to have quantitative data, make comparisons between schools, and decide which towns, regions, schools will get more funds, in a sense, to legitimize the good work done. Okay, if you get better marks, it means that your methods and way of teaching are better, and therefore, in this particular case, Italy, we follow through with this educative system, hopefully being able to provide a better education to future generations. Okay. Now, it's sad to say perhaps, but it's reasonable to imagine that at least some students will be pushed by some teachers even to perhaps take some smart drugs to perform in these tests. Okay? And why is that problematic? Well, because it's likely that that will alter the actual assessment of different educative systems. Okay? And that would mean that perhaps schools and teachers that were able to provide particular systems of education that were valid would be dismissed to make room to instead a group of teachers or schools that were not particularly exceptional, if aside from the fact that they took those drugs that allowed them to perform particularly well in these tests. Again, this is an example. Of course, this is a rather limited test. I mean, you know, to have an evaluation based on A and B, but it's just to make it a bit more visual. And so, all in all, this would be extremely damaging. And the fact that there would be no duty to disclose the use of such substances will not make it easy for us to understand the actual performance. Now, this is a third example that perhaps helps us also picturing a less selfish reason for using PC. Okay. Now let's imagine that Mike is a young man that is really willing to help his community. He wants to help others. Okay. So he decides to become a fire brigade because he thinks that this is the best way for him to help his community. And but the problem is that he struggled to concentrate before written tests. So he's talking with a friend of his that actually suffers from ADHD. So he has written with himself, and he tells him, "Look, I've been told that if you are not affected by ADHD, but you take Ritalin, you manage to be extremely focused. So perhaps I will give you a couple of pills, and before the exam you take them, and That way you will be calm and you will be able to actually show what you already know, and then you pass the test. So he thinks that that's fine. He doesn't see any moral issue. So he takes the pills just before the test and is able to pass it. And without him knowing, straight after, like a couple of hours after the oral test, there is the practical, the theoretical test, there is the practical test, and he is also still affected by Ritalin, and he sees that even in practical terms is more focused. So he basically feels that is able to be the better version of himself, still moved by the idea that his mission is to be as performative as possible, to be a better performer. Okay. And of course, for the sake of the example, after 6 months that is taken as a fire brigade and is performing wonderfully, the day that a major fire takes place in his town, is out of Ritalin, and his friend is out of town, so he's basically without his smart drugs. So what happens is that he underperforms. He doesn't likely make any damages, and there are no major injuries, and yet his boss is able to tell that something is wrong. So when the fire is dealt with, he asks him, what happened? What happened today? And because he had a clear conscience, he says with no problem, well, look, I was using Ritalin, and today I was just, I didn't have any, so I underperformed. And the boss goes crazy, and he says that he has to resign immediately, because not only he didn't tell him up front, but he put at risk his unit, his team, and people that are counting on fire brigaders. And the idea there is that he, the boss, says that he should always know who can do what under all circumstances, and taking away this variable restricted his understanding of how the team was composed. So going back to these local versus global effects, the duty to disclose the use of PCE is not just intended to prevent local effects from prevailing on global effects, okay?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. So the duty to disclose the use of cognitive enhancers is not just intended to prevent local effects from prevailing on global effects. It's also written, by the way. So those that make use of cognitive enhancers in single occasions or non-repeatable competitive situations seems to be required to report the sudden difference that has arisen in their abilities without this enhancement depending on something they can be credited for. Okay? Now, in relation to, and here I will make, you can't hear me?
I can hear. I need a shorter sentence, just something a little bit more succinct.
Okay.
Because I can't explain.
Right. Okay. Well, let me put it this way. So there are two levels of discussion. One has to do with the single individual taking the smart drug for no particular reason, sort of entertainment, if you like, and that's something that can be discussed in the legal sphere. Certainly, we will not be talking about that here. But for what concerns the interconnection between the local and global spheres, something has to be taken into account, despite the fact that he might enter our private sphere. Okay. And what is it's important is that we should be taking into account that someone using those altering substances perhaps should not get the credit for certain results that they get. I mean, again, we talk about academic doping when we talk about smart drugs. Generally, there is a tendency to not see doping as something really fair and praiseworthy. It's likely that that should work the same way in for what concerns cognitive enhancers. Certainly, it's true as well that the advantage that we might have in certain instances of using those boosters could benefit humanity as a whole. If you imagine everyone becoming, great minds, possibly society could work better, perhaps, but it's not given either. And in fact, the next move that we will make, which is rather abrupt, is somehow related to that. Are we changing ourselves because of the substances, or are substances changing ourselves? Well, let's see. Now, this is already dated, likely in a way, but captagon, which is an amphetamine, which in a sense, I mean, according to the legal framework that we refer to, an amphetamine can be legal or illegal. The moment that it becomes legal, we could call them smart drugs. And we will see in a few moments, a few slides, this connection between legal and illegal, illicit and illicit. But captagon made loads of headlines because was, I should say, an amphetamine used massively by ISIS in Syria, but not only. And of course, like all amphetamines, it altered the perception of the users. And quoting from Kamiensky's book, he wrote, Kurdish civilians who escaped Cobain recalled that ISIS fighters are filthy with straggly beards and long black nails. They have lots of pills with them that they all keep taking. It seems to make them more crazy, if anything. Their acts of savage atrocities can thus be explained as resulting not only from extreme Jihad and Islamic State's ferocious culture, but also from drug-induced psychopathy. Jihadist fighters are also reported to use other drugs such as cocaine, heroin, and hashish. They are, in a word, ion to intoxicants, jihad, and psychostimulants. Okay. Now, before we might end up thinking, well, here we go. There is theological enhancement or whatever. I mean, here I changed the nomenclature. Here I talk about PED, so performance enhancing drugs. Okay, it just is a slight difference for a reason. And drugs are not newer. I mean, since the beginning of times, the Romans used them. Just to stick to more recent times, we know that during the Vietnam War, for example, there was use of heroin, marijuana, and other drugs by the US soldiers that pushed President Nixon to finance the first large-scale rehab program in the US. So it was really a social issue. And it was also the last war in which it was compulsory for males, generally speaking, to become soldiers after it became more pro, like it is in Italy now. So there also actually it was more detaching from reality than performing as such. Instead, if we think of other instances, there was during Second World War, Nazis used pervitin, which was an amphetamine, and it's important to take into consideration that the Allies troops also used them, so it was rather common. And again, we should not forget that amphetamines initially they were used for to boost the performance in studies. So again, the connection is pretty evident. Now, in recent times, namely after the Afghan war, or during the Afghan war, I should say, the US Air Force had started to use again amphetamine, regulated, extremely regulated, namely pilots, and that's only for pilots. Pilots are allowed to use amphetamines on their way back from missions. Okay, they need to report them. They are not expected to use them, but they are expected to agree to the fact that if they feel too tired on their way back from a mission, they can take this pill, or how many they are, I don't know, to be honest. I think one. Now, this means that just recently, that's a decade, a bit more now, some use of amphetamines have become acceptable, if not expected, by our society. Is for a certain group of our society, and in certain instances, but yet is acceptable. And as I said, in some instances, even required. Now, what's interesting, and this will connect also to the next talk that we will have in the next hour, is the way that an investigation of the New York Times connected the extensive use of smart drugs such as Ritalin and Adderall and PTSD, okay, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is pretty high among US troops. Now, there have been some proposals, studies, that imagine the possibility of removing certain traumatic memories from soldiers, so to make them deal better with PTSD. Well, what is interesting to take into consideration is that PTSD might be caused by the use of those smart drugs. So in other words, going back to the slide that I used earlier, why are we drugging our soldiers? I mean, if we are drugging them to perform, but we are aware of the fact that this will increase their chances to suffer from PTSD, and then we want to cure them from that, well, perhaps we should stop up front and not create a scenario in which they suffer from PTSD. And these side effects of smart drugs are, of course, crucial. Should we reach a stage in which there are no side effects, it's likely that we will have less of a problem to see it as problematic, aside from the dysfunctional aspect that I told you about and the possibility of increasing the inequality, okay? So of course, those that are in favor of larger use of those drugs are pushing for it. This is an interesting study that took place in Israel. In this case, they found out that beta-alanine supplementation that is widely used if it managed to deal with situation of fatigue. Okay. Now, in this particular study, there was no. It was not shown that the cognitive performances improved, but power performance, marksmanship, and target engagement speed did improve. And what is relevant about this study is the fact that first of all, there is, as I said, this willingness by at least a part of society to try to minimize PED side effects, so to make them more acceptable and perceived as more illicit. And also that fatigue is at the center of the study. And fatigue management has become more and more a crucial aspect that we deal with more in working contexts, both military and civilians. Okay, why am I saying that? Well, because I'll bring you another example from a tragedy of a plane crash that took place in 2016 by Fly Dubai. As I said, so there was this crash of a plane, and Russia Today, which is a Russian TV that broadcasts in English, made an investigation, and the finding was that in a number of semi-official interviews, pilots of Fly Dubai stressed the fact that they were working longer shifts, that they were pushed to the limit and sometimes beyond it. And now, aside from the fact that there are some speculations that can be made that accident could have been avoided. Well, first of all, that accident maybe took place because the pilot was particularly tired, and therefore they could have been avoided. But trying to make a connection with what I told you before, namely that military pilots are allowed the use of amphetamines when particularly tired, namely returning from their mission, one could imagine that the same argument could be made in civilian context. Even more so, in fact, because if you think, aside from the price, I mean, not the price, the price of the airplane itself, in terms of lives, if I'm a pilot of a civilian flight, I'll probably carrying, I don't know, 200 people, whereas with the military pilot, in terms of numbers, those are just a few maximum. So if the idea is that under certain circumstances, we should allow this exception of the amphetamine use, so to preserve the attention of the pilot and avoid a crash, it would make sense perhaps to implement it also in civilian context. The problem there is that if that becomes the expected reaction, then it might well be that we will have longer shifts and expectations of having to subscribe to this altering of our fatigue levels. Okay, and I think that's rather problematic. So, trying to give you some conclusions so that we can have a few minutes of discussion if you want to. Now, fairness in respecting the equality of the starting conditions as a principle of respect for the others leads to reveal aspects related to chance or to the sporadic. And I've lost you. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, let's make it simpler. So there are some aspects that deserve particular attention when it comes down to the use of PC. Namely, those are the way that the individual interconnects himself or herself with society. So we are part of a larger community, global community, I would say. And the argument that once the single individual, in a sense, obliged to push his or her limit might work up to a certain level, even if those motives are very much altruistic. We have seen the fire brigade example, but the result of not allowing the others to know what am I doing and how am I reacting and what am I using to perform in a certain way can create a number of dysfunctional scenarios. And this is one aspect that should be taken into account. And another one is that the possibility of having better and drugs with less side effects could again be beneficial if properly directed, but we should be careful with their implementation, because we don't want to end up having drugs used in our system, so just to work longer shifts and be paid the same. It doesn't really make sense, aside from perhaps a few that will benefit from that. So yeah, so those are just a few thoughts. Hopefully that has shaken you a little, just to start the morning right. And so I'll, thank you for now, and I'll be happy to answer a few questions if you have any. Yeah. So I don't know if there is a microphone. Well, because I think he might not think. Okay. Sorry, I can't hear you so well. No, just I can't hear you. It's not that I don't understand you.
Side of the coin, and other side is that the state or whoever will have to regulate and have all our data, health data, regulate our. If you understand where I'm going, even more surveillance state, even less privacy.
Yes.
And this is one thing. The other thing, as things are now, there is not so much surveillance state in that area. So we have biohacking, you know about it. So people, it's outside of area of medical professionals, and people are doing it, but by themselves at home. They have laboratories at home. They have all movements at home, biohacking. And the third, yes, there are some circumstances that require this drug. You may mention HDND, but also the medical professionals are less and less medical professionals in traditional sense, but they're more like service providers and technical staff as the medicine itself changes. So you can always find a doctor who will prescribe this medication to you. So it's not also clear. This is the only thing I would like to point out. There is always another part, and we should be, I think, careful in advocating any solution very strong at this point. I don't know what you think.
Okay, thank you. So, well, those are, some of them are huge things. I'll try to be brief, then we can discuss it later perhaps, but starting with the last point, medical professional, I mean, yeah, the doctors are service providers. Yes and no. There has been a recent study that still in the US, it showed that for some students, it's kind of given, it's very much in line with what you're saying, it's kind of given that even if the symptoms are not there, it's going to be extremely easy for them to find someone in, I'm not going to say doctors, but let's say in the health system that will help them fitting the description that allows them to take these smart drugs. And of course, that's an issue, but you know, one could link it back to just corruption, if you want. If it's not economical, it might be moral in this particular sense. Or it could be that, and that's also, it's interesting, that again, this is more the anthropological aspect that I think is going to be taken more care of tomorrow. It could also be that not necessarily all those doctors think of the smart drugs as something damaging or worth that much of consideration. It might just be that they actually think, yeah, well, after all, you know, he or she is a kid and he wants to perform better, and I don't see a particular problem with that. Which, of course, it's something that for what concerns biohacking, yes, there is plenty to be said and seen. There's been this example of this person injecting himself, you know, with gene editing. That's again, I mean, situations like this, I think, push us to question a lot of things. Among others, also the fact that I'm all in favor for freedom, but I think that the problem that we are having in this society is that this democratization of knowledge is at times extremely risky, because to have someone, like if I start talking about physics and I go on YouTube, I'm gonna do damages to children that are studying it now, because I have no idea how physics works. But maybe I read 2 blogs and I feel that I'm the new Einstein or, you know, Hawking. And the problem is that we're not ready to have those kind of filters. Of course, the downside, and this kind of goes back to the first point, is censorship, right? I mean, censorship combined with this health data. Yeah, I mean, those are all very, very sensitive aspects, but just to close, I don't know if there are other questions. If not, we'll move on. But the interesting aspect there is that sometimes we provide this data without perhaps the awareness that we are disclosing some variables. For example, if you go running and you use a free app that tracks your data, maybe if someone would ask you, so would you want to have your movement recorded by some provider that can then sell it to shoemakers? Probably would say no. But the fact that you can download an app for free that does exactly that doesn't really help you process it. So I don't know. Yeah, you know, more questions to the questions. You don't know, but anyway, thank you. Yeah. Where's the mic? Ah. Thank you.
Perhaps this might dovetail off of the last question just slightly, but I'm just wondering your opinion on, within the United States, there is a movement towards cosmetic enhancement and or cosmetic neurology, such that within the United States, we already have some neurologists now prescribing cognitive enhancers strictly for the purposes of, you know, cosmetic sort of boutique enhancement purposes. And this is outside of the academy, necessarily just within society. And do you think this push towards a more cosmetic framework, such that we classify it more like plastic surgeries, would affect the argument of disclosure?
Okay, thank you. Well, one thing I can tell you for sure is that this the terminology is interesting. I mean, you know, it's already cosmetic enhancement, right? So it's not, by default, you are put in a lower position. So aside from the fact that we standardize beauty in all these forms, and I think that is problematic in itself. I think the next colleague, she will be talking about neuroaesthetics. I don't know if she will touch, possibly she will touch upon this. But yeah, more broadly, I think that moves such as this one, I mean, cosmetic enhancement or aesthetic enhancement is something that has changed in recent years. Up until, I don't know, 2 decades ago, it would have been plastic surgery or something along those lines. So already this shift certainly is functional to embracing more and more this vision of accepting it. So yes, in short, I kind of agree. I think it's a way of pushing her to accept more these other forms of that. Thank you. Right. I think we might move to the next talk, which is still me.